Hello and welcome. My name is John Wright and I'm a Postdoctoral Research Associate at the Centre for Cultural Value. And I'm here to talk about a 15-month collaborative national research project led by ourselves at the Centre, based at the University of Leeds. The project is really interesting because the findings help to frame the current state of play in which we find ourselves, but also provide some really kind of hard-hitting questions about the cultural and creative industries, and more broadly, the entire arts and cultural ecology. So I thought, firstly, that I would outline a little of the background of the project and what it involved to give you some context before I move on to the findings and the questions that we have. So the project was in collaboration with the Audience Agency and the Policy and Evidence Centre, the PEC, which at the time was hosted at Nesta. The project was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the HRC, through the UK Research and Innovations COVID-19 Rapid Rollout Call. This gives you a kind of overview of the project itself, and the aim really was to take the temperature of the cultural sector using various research methods, and importantly feeding this information directly into DCMS and other governmental departments across all 4 nations of the UK. And as such, as you can see, it was a massive undertaking. The slide will hopefully capture some of this scope. So there were 35 team members and 24 researchers from representation across the UK, from Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. One of the key strands was the audience analysis strand, which was led by the Audience Agency, and it was based on a sampling of audience experience, a comprehensive overview, a longitudinal study of audience participation in culture and creative activity, and we were able to monitor trends and feed new questions and data into their cultural participation monitor, and vice versa, which actually is still going on. So alongside this, we had cultural sector analysis, and this was really where the quant and qual of the project came together. So alongside this, we ran a mix of qualitative and quantitative analysis of the cultural sector based on 238 in-depth interviews with individuals, within organisations across the UK, museums and galleries, freelancers, festivals in Scotland, Screen Sector in Wales, networks of leadership in Northern Ireland, across as many art forms as you can imagine. So some of these interviews were incredibly harrowing, and actually we tried to feed through this real kind of emergency situation and how it developed over the course of the project. Alongside this, we had a social media analysis of over 9,000 tweets from the hashtag Culture in Quarantine and hashtag Museums at Home. And crucially, to back this qualitative data up, we had a quantitative analysis of the labour force data from the ONS, which is actually ongoing, and led by Dave O'Brien. So we accompanied these 2 strands with an in-depth ecosystems analysis of Manchester, led by Abby Gilmore, which gave us a sense of the impact of the pandemic in place, with the specific socio-cultural and political constitutions of that environment. And finally, the policy engagement, which became key to the project. So we had various elements to this. So we had the 6 placements within various different levels of government across the UK. I actually took part in 2 of those. We had the briefings with DCMS to present our findings. We had the PEC presenting for the spending review submission. We had regular submissions with APPGs to government inquiries, and we had meetings with the policy reference group, which we convened. So as you can imagine, it was quite an undertaking. So to the findings. So the main finding with the workforce was that it held a mirror up to a deeply unequal cultural sector, which we already knew. And actually, we found that it exacerbated this situation. And as you can see, certain parts of the population were hit more than others, including younger workers, women, and workers from ethnically diverse backgrounds were actually hit the most. And obviously, with the headlines in the cultural sector, freelancers were actually hit incredibly hard, actually. Especially, it was devastating for many in the interviews that we undertook. So this figure of a decline of about 10% by the end of 2020 is quite stark. And also within the cultural and creative industries, the actual sort of industries that were hit most were music, performing, and visual arts, where we actually found that with the workforce, the professional workforce fell right around a quarter, and actually hasn't really recovered from that. And we can make some kind of assertions about why certain occupations did better than others, and actually it's very complex, obviously, and it's obviously down to the way that those occupations work and those cultural industries work. But I kind of see that within publishing, for example, it's likely to be a higher percentage male, white, and although there isn't class on this, they fared better than other people. So that is kind of one of the things. And again, with architecture, it's very, very kind of similar situation. So moving on to kind of key findings with organisations rather than the workforce. So we found the Cultural Recovery Fund a lifesaver. A lot of the interviewees sort of came back with that it was really important that they received that funding, but actually that funding was invested into things that were already being invested in, so we kind of knew that it was going to save buildings and institutions that were kind of already receiving this kind of funding historically from Arts Council, etc. What was really interesting though was networks played a really massive role, especially building resilience. So we saw networks of care developing originally when everybody didn't know what the hell was going on. As the pandemic hit, these networks formed as kind of support groups, but some networks then went on to becoming kind of strategic and even lobbying in some cases. So in Northern Ireland, for example, some networks sort of came together to help lobby the government at the time to kind of provide provision for the arts and cultural sector. We saw this in Manchester, as I'm going to talk about a little bit later. This idea of networks became really, really important. On the flip side of that, we saw some real increased signs of burnout and real deterioration in mental health across the sector, especially through some of the interviews. This became a real problem. But actually many organisations and cultural organisations considered their relationships with their current kind of situation, their place, their locality. And we saw a real movement towards the local community for both obvious reasons with lockdowns, but also as a kind of area of provision where these organisations felt compelled to help. So this is kind of civic duty was mentioned quite a lot in the interviews. And skills gaps as well. This was a major point. We discovered huge HR, fundraising, digital marketing, depending on what kind of sub industry they were in or what kind of sub area of the cultural sector. Whether it was in kind of artist led, for example, there was no HR in that kind of area, in that arena. Marketing and fundraising was really difficult for some small festivals, etc. And digital, where the misunderstanding, especially for a lot of cultural organisations, quite small ones, about how to do it and do it well for their audiences. There was a lot of kind of learning curve early on for that. So these are kind of the areas that are really needed to be focused on within the cultural sector in general. So this is just a breakdown of cultural recovery funds. Again, as you can see, London received quite a hefty amount, and also core cities outside of London. So it was very kind of city-based in that sense. And you can kind of see that through the representation of kind of small towns and villages, etc., compared to kind of core cities in London. I'll just give you a second to really think about that. But other cities also received quite a bit, as we're going to talk about with Manchester. This slide is the kind of total value by region. As you can see, the Southwest only received 9%, along with like lower amounts with the Northeast, etc. So the CRF funding was essentially distributed in the way that we thought it would, with some kind of anomalies really, like the Greater Manchester situation. So I'll move on now to the Greater Manchester situation, and I think this is a really interesting kind of ecosystems analysis and case study in and of itself. And what was really interesting about this situation is that Manchester was hit the same as everywhere else, really, but it managed to mitigate the shock by concentrating on various specific kind of networks that it already had. So the involvement of the local authority, including the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, in cooperation with the 10 district councils and their long-standing political engagement in the contribution to the arts and to culture, and the wider prioritisation of culture embedded within local cultural strategies and frameworks, led to cultural partnerships and governance forming throughout the pandemic, and this cultural leaders group developing, which established an infrastructure which had already been there, which managed to kind of combat some of the ravages of the pandemic. So strong local networks were key sources of information and guidance, enabling cultural venues to have the confidence to close early on like the 16th of March, 10 days ahead of the national lockdown. So local authorities lifted conditions on expected outputs for their funding organisations, not funded organisations, freeing up finances to manage the immediate impact of the pandemic. So the GMCA advanced 6 months worth of funding to its portfolio organisations on the basis that it drafted a cultural recovery plan, which rerouted strategic funding towards the immediate impact of the pandemic, prioritising areas not covered by the National Cultural Recovery Plan. So helped to mitigate the impact on artists and freelancers and workers was an immediate priority for the sector in Manchester. So by the end of March, the GMCA and the Manchester International Festival had launched parallel programmes of targeted grants and micro-commissions, operating in advance of those from the DCMS and arm's-length cultural bodies. So the GMCA also invested in United We Stream, which is a new initiative which hosted live-streamed events from local artists and organisations, generating donations from crowdfunding, which were distributed as grants to freelancers. So a programme producing creative care kits brought a sector together with the community and voluntary organisations to deliver cultural activities which were suitable to lockdowns and to neighbourhoods and targeted vulnerable groups. So this kind of coming together really culminated on the how Manchester actually and the Cultural Leaders Group dominated the CRF bids, so pooling their resources for collaborative programming and marketing. And the Salford Cultural and Place Partnership relocated public funds to support the city's wider programming of COVID-safe commissions and cultural activity in parks and open spaces. So they really pulled on what they had together with solid cultural strategies already in place, which is really kind of interesting. So finally, to audiences. So despite the rapid uptake in vaccines, we thought there would be then a rapid uptake in kind of opening up and audiences really engaging in culture again live. But actually the confidence has actually remained stubbornly low within some groups. And the rush to return amongst younger and urban audiences kind of masked this long-term behaviour from the older generation, which is really quite troubling actually. And while a shift to digital has happened in some way, it's failed to actually attract new audiences. So what has kind of happened is that audiences that were already engaging, this kind of super engagers, what just shifted to digital. So actually it hasn't really opened the floodgates, so to speak. However, it was really good for accessibility. So we found in the interviews many people said that they, for example, with the festivals in Scotland, that people that couldn't make the journey to those really remote festivals but really wanted to go were actually able to go when the festivals made their digital offer. So that was really quite interesting. Interestingly as well, the bottom bullet point, 80% of survey respondents said that taking part in arts and culture was important to their well-being, positively affecting their mood and helping them manage anxiety. This well-being thing really came out in the pandemic, and culture's role in well-being became really apparent. And again, this kind of reiterates this. So these are kind of the areas, the venues, the places where people go, and found that it was kind of really important for their well-being. So you can see if you've got an outdoor historic parks or gardens heritage space, you're kind of in the money at the moment. That's where people want to go. And these kind of trends are continuing. So finally, to kind of wrap things up, the kind of implications and recommendations that we have. So revolutionary change is needed. Less is more, I think, and this very specifically this regenerative approach. You know, people and organisations and freelancers and everybody in the cultural sector need to do what is best for them in a kind of situation where there are so many pressures. So maybe more quality, but less programming is needed. We also need to identify better ways to support freelancers ultimately. Map who is, active, and how best to kind of do that, really. We need to develop new ways to tour. So there are huge kind of problems with touring due to Brexit, but also due to the cost and sustainability wise. So what we found actually was some local touring became quite kind of impactful within Scotland and Northern Ireland, and that kind of model is more sustainable. And maybe having, for example, like museums and galleries, stripped a lot of their programs out, and those big international touring shows, for example, were actually maybe having one a year rather than 4, that kind of thing. I think that is the kind of way forward, especially with like keeping these buildings open with the energy crisis. New ways are going to be needed to think about how we use them, and I think COVID was the beginning of that. Support networks and to foster creativity and collectivity, and especially leadership within those. So those networks themselves becoming a space for leaders to kind of develop, really, and leadership to develop. Those networks are really important, and that connection and relationship needs to carry on post-pandemic and into the now, especially. So we need to invest in the cultural sector. So especially research and development. There is not much funding for that, and never has been. But this kind of needs to change, especially if we were to produce, high quality theatre that is digital, etc. Or shows, etc. Through those kind of systems, and how we distribute them. How are online systems developed for that? To sustain that. This movement to local was really interesting, and place shaping an investment in the local, not forgetting who those people are, and that are kind of in your situation, really, and how museums and galleries, for example, can actually really help their local community. Instead of putting a wall up, moving to collaborative working and investment. Invest in HR support, as we've kind of talked about, and obviously this do less. So I hope you enjoyed that. It was a quick whistle-stop kind of tour of the project and some questions going forward, especially in this moment of kind of crisis that we are in again. And if you've got any kind of questions, please do email us or contact us. And thank you very much.